this, I'm trying to reconceptualize my dissertation to something meaningful that can, and the values that I'm talking about here are from value statements, which I'll highlight why that's different than how a lot of research has been doing it. Let's just go for it. Yeah. All right. So, international NGOs and the humanitarian sector has been growing, immensely since the 80s. I know that these, I just screenshotted a few things. Right now, the state of the humanitarian system thinks there's around 200 meaningfully big international NGOs in the system, what they consider maybe $10 million or more in annual budget. They raise, if you look here, they raise about $9 billion compared to multilateral organizations, which are around $13 billion. But then they help the multilaterals spend another $4 or $5 billion of their money. So a lot of the humanitarian aid money from the sector funnels through an international NGO at some point in the time. My estimates are about 40% of all humanitarian aid comes to an international NGO at some point. They've become increasingly integrated into the system, not just as service delivery mechanisms, but they are, innovators in different ways of doing humanitarian work. They have become really big into advocacy. Obviously, that gets a lot of attention nowadays. And they're extremely influential in how the system is coordinated. With OCHA's cluster system, Save the Children is the lead on one cluster, and different international NGOs are the backup leads on other clusters if the UN doesn't have a presence at the time. They are involved in the needs assessment. They're involved in soliciting funds and for the SURF and managing the funds that the UN distributes. So they're very integrated into the system now, which is quite new since the 80s, when they were just running around rampant and no one really knew what was going on. Now they're institutionalized to the nth degree. But the sector has been changing quite a bit. First, we started realizing that most of the disasters we're responding to are not natural disasters, where they're man-made crises or long, drawn-out droughts or with war-related. And so that changes the way you respond to a humanitarian crisis when they're not just hurricanes and typhoons. In 2018, when there was a survey of leaders in humanitarian sector, what they've realized is poverty is no longer the unifying focus. We're not trying to eradicate poverty. Climate change is more important than poverty now. We're thinking about a whole host of different factors, but poverty doesn't even show up on the top topics of when these leaders are talking about. Their issue of always funding, whether that's really a legitimate issue or not, since they've been getting richer and richer, I don't know. But they're worried, they're concerned about, the private sector is realizing there's a lot of money in here, and so they're competing for that money. So now they're competing not only with other international NGOs, they're competing with the private sector, which changes the whole dynamic. The private sector also has sometimes more money than the governments, so they're trying to get money from the private sector as well. And the private sector looks at different things than the government does when they're allocating money. So that changes the conversation. Data, collaboration, measuring impact, these are all things that in the early 80s, this was not on being discussed at all. So things have changed. And then a big one here that I think we need to explore even more, I think is causing a lot of perplexity, is I guess Professor Zoli had this return to sovereignty. But since the early 2000s, developing countries have taken the lead as the most legitimate actors in development, and NGOs have had to step back, and they're no longer the favored children of donor governments. And that changes, when you're no longer the favorite child, that hurts. Sir?
Why isn't measuring anywhere on the theme?
Why isn't what?
Measuring.
You'd have to ask the people that responded, but I think it gets caught up in the impact when you're talking about measuring impact. That's usually those things come together in the conversation, but I didn't do this interview. I'm just taking from. Yeah. So the world's changing, and how do NGOs respond? They've done a lot of things over the years to respond. They started off with, all signing allegiance to the International Red Cross's humanitarian principles, and the core humanitarian standards have started developing, and there's these principles on how you act as a humanitarian that started off with just 4, and now it's up to 8 or 9, and it has issues, about safeguarding and gender-based violence and collaboration and measuring for results and having complaint mechanisms, and it's become very, institutionalized and bureaucratized. We have sphere standards now, which you started off covering agriculture, but now it covers almost everything. And basically, it's a manual for if you're delivering water, here's how many liters you should deliver, and here's the process that you should do for creating latrines, and here's what you should think about for livestock. And so a lot of standards and a lot of measurement stuff.
What's a sphere?
The sphere is just the name of the group that's been compiling these things. And they've been doing this, basically on their own. The NGOs get together, often the big NGOs. Maybe there's 1 or 2 UN representatives, and they just claim to be experts and write standards, and people decide whether they want to follow them or not. And it's a nice cover to say that you followed the sphere standards, and then you're safe somehow. We have the INGO Accountability Charter, so this gets into governance, and now these NGOs are pledging allegiance to these charters and how governing well and participation and all the things that we think about good governance. And you can read on their website, on this NGO charter website, these reports that they're, aside from the annual reports and their own organizational reports, they're standardized reports so they can claim that we are operating as, good citizens of the globe. We're watching the environment. We're including beneficiaries in our governance mechanisms, and they do all these things. And they came together, and they've even voted the world set of CSO, civil society organization values. So this was thousands of CSOs getting together in preparation of responding to the DAC and to the OECD countries and saying, this is how you're changing development, this is what we stand in and why we believe we should be involved in this process. And so it was a big deal. They came up with these 8 Istanbul principles. We'll talk more about that. They're basically a set of values. And individually, they've been rethinking their strategies and moving from service delivery to advocacy and different changes. And they've adapted their governance structures to adjust to this changing climate. So when I talk about governance structures, this is what I'm thinking about. You can generally, no matter what the variation is, there's generally a board and usually a general assembly that elects the board, but not always. There's a secretariat that does something, but not always. And there's members that sometimes are affiliates, sometimes they're called constituents, sometimes they're called all kinds of different things, but somehow they're below the secretariat. And together, this becomes a system of and processes concerned with ensuring the overall direction, control, and accountability of the organization. And I'm focusing on these 3 dimensions as we'll move forward, why this is important that we look at all of these pieces and how they interact. Does it make sense? Okay. So it's been well documented from the big NGOs that all of us are aware of, that they've changed over time. So even back in 2000, they were already showing how these larger NGOs have changed over the years, gone back and forth, centralization, decentralization. We've had the benefit of using all kinds of different ways of naming these different forms. This was one older one. but there's many different ways of naming them, but never systematically analyzing. If you fall into one, you just kind of get plugged into one based on what the researcher thinks they are. And why they change into these evolving to these different structures, lots of explanations, not a whole lot of empirical evidence, but case studies usually. It's all to attract resources in the environment, some say. Some say it's because they have an identity that they're trying to uphold, and they organize around that identity. Accountability obviously becomes a big thing, who you're accountable to. Not that these are independent explanations, because power and just internally they're trying to grab power from each other, the members of this. And then the donors. The donors seem to like one form of organizing maybe or another. So these are many of the explanations that are given. There's case studies sometimes to discuss why they change, but we don't have a whole lot of empirical evidence about this. And we also, these aren't mutually exclusive explanations. These are discipline-favored explanations that tend to overlap quite a bit. So I'm going to throw in my favorite explanation, and that's values. And here's why I think values are important. Values are a fundamental of culture and leadership, which is an explanation on structure. Values influence decision-making and strategy, which is also an explanation for structure. Values are embedded in governance arrangements, which in and of itself is a direct link. And values are linked to, when people study values, they often notice that differences occur that focus on who I'm relating to and how I relate to them. So I value someone over another person, and I choose to relate to them one way over another way. That's one way that organization scholars have been able to classify values. So all these reasons are why values, I think, might matter. But values are different than value statements. There's a gentleman in 2003 wrote this 2 sentences that I find intriguing. The public administration community needs to focus more attention on how values can be integrated into the structures, processes, and systems of public organizations. Greater emphasis should be placed on the value statement as the central component of a values regime. This author was focusing on values-based leadership and setting a tone and a culture, and arguing that one way, maybe the preferred way to do that, is let's state what values are driving the leader in the organization. Let's state them explicitly in the value statement and then try to govern by them and embed those values in a system. So that suggests, that a system is an expression of values. We generally think that organizational structures that respond to resources and efficiency could be a value. But these structures are an expression of values. So are they actually put into value statements? Well, there's plenty of people to tell you that that's just rubbish. I have my friend here looked at the Fortune 100, is that what they're called? Organizations, and he's like, all these value statements are the same. They're the same words, they're the same everything. He's like, it's nonsense. But interestingly, what he did notice was, because he looked at vision, mission, and value statements, the similarities were in the values, but the missions and visions were somehow different. So that he thought, and we can talk about that. An alumnus from here at Syracuse argued that, okay, we have these value statements, but they mean different things to different people. And so really value statements are rubbish. Another reason why they're kind of, can you really lead by value statements? And then another friend of mine, they realized basically we mimic the people that we're connected to. So we adjust our value statements based on who we're related to. And those are all well and good. And I don't necessarily think that those are damning critiques of the use of value statements. we do have some evidence that organizations do use a lot of similar words, but the way they use them is different. And they highlight who they really cared about. So these guys found out that there was difference in value statements where I'm expressing goodwill to you, but the focus is on my expression of goodwill to you, not my goodwill for you as the focus of my expression, right? And so there's different ways of expressing the same value that either draw attention to me or draw attention to those who I'm trying to serve. So maybe there's something there. So what I did is I looked at 41, I think that's supposed to be 41, international NGOs, asking these two questions. What are the values that they're expressing, and is there any relationship with how they're governed? I collected the data from strategic plans and annual reports, the places where you would expect to find value statements. And this is a little bit old, so this covers the fiscal year 2014 when I collected this. And I used in vivo. So I wanted to focus on the humanitarian sector. So we have the State of the Humanitarian Sector report that gets published every few years. So I asked them what their methodology for identifying organizations, and I tried to follow a similar methodology. So they define this humanitarian system as the network of interconnected institutional and operational entities through which humanitarian assistance is provided when local and national resources are insufficient to meet the needs of a population in crisis. And here's their picture of who they're talking about. And I'm just focusing on the international NGOs part, but they're part of this bigger system that we're looking at. So I looked at databases from almost all of the OECD countries who was a registered international NGO in each of those countries. And then I looked at 5 international databases, and I looked to see whether these organizations were on the internet, on at least one international database and at least 2 national databases that showed me that they had some kind of a broader scope. And then I only chose organizations or networks, depending on the form, that had at least 3 autonomous members identified. So it wasn't just one. The Mercy Corps is not on here. They have a base in the U.S. They have, I think, an office now in Scotland. So there's 2 that have their own independent boards. How independent they are, we can discuss, but they have 2 independent sites. So for this, there had to be at least 3. It was a way for me to narrow down things. And it also, when you have more than 3 or more, then you have to start thinking about your global governance arrangements more than if you just have one site, so you can see more variation. The 41 that they range from an annual budget of just around $3 million to almost $3 billion. So there's a wide range. They can be in as few as 13 countries operating and as many as 164 countries. There's about 50-50 split, whether they're secular or faith-based. And they're headquartered or they originated in a wide variety of countries. So I'm not looking just at U.S. international NGOs. I'm trying to capture the international system. So of course the UK and the US have the most. They have the most money to give. But France and Germany each are represented with 4 organizations. Italy, Netherlands, and Switzerland have 2 each, and then a few have 1. And interestingly, we have 3 that are headquartered or originated in the global south. So there's not that many of them. So I think there's a fairly decent representation of the system.
I'm curious why you labeled the bottom political.
Because this is a political organization. Their political origins are from a certain political. But I shouldn't have. What would you prefer?
Oh no, I just wanted to hear your explanation.
Yeah. It was ways different than philosophical origins, and without getting too fine-grained.
Right.
Yeah.
But there is a distinction between those people who are advancing the political ideology from the U.S. and those who are doing human.
No, it just simply means that they originated in a certain political geographic area.
Okay.
You said national.
Yeah, national would have been a better one. Thank you. Yeah.
106, did you say?
There was 106 organizations. What I'm analyzing are the 41 that have at least 3 member sites. Yeah. So I have data on the other ones, but I'm not showing you that. So a little bit of breakdown when I looked at their governance arrangements. So we know that there's lots of typologies. This was done inductively first, and then I labeled them using known terminology. And there's some distinctions in how these organizations are organized. First, there's just differences on the board. So there's some where the board is an independent board from any member, or it's independent but elected by the members. There are boards that are elected by the members. Each member sends one of their board members to be on the global board. That's different than the next group where each member sends a board member to be at a high level and each member sends an executive director to be at a second level of governance. So there's 2 tiers, one at the board and one at the executive director level. Then there's those that just send their executive directors to be the governing body. And then again, in the unitary, there's independent boards. How they vote on those boards can vary. A lot of them, it's equal. But in the unitary, they're connected often by interlocks by the president or founder, and so obviously that person has a little bit more say on all of the different members' boards. And then in this group here, more money, more power. If I contribute more money to the network, I have more votes on the board. Pretty simple. But not all organizations. This group does, right? And the members are different. In this group, the members tend to represent the world. If you have an office in that country, you have a vote on the General Assembly at least. So the Global South is well represented in these organizations. That doesn't mean that none of these organizations are working in the Global South. It's just that the Global South doesn't have representation on the board. So for this organization, only those that contribute funding to the board can be a member. Confederations are slightly different because not only do you contribute funding, but you also have some implementation capacity. Coalitions, again, you have funding capacity and implementation capacity. And in the unitary, again, it returns to the funders. If you can contribute money, you can have a representation or a face. So we see these different governance arrangements. So what are the values? So I highlighted that since the 80s, the NGOs in the sector have become more and more unified and kind of institutionalized. And they started off with, they all pretty much ascribed to this, the ICRC, and then OCHA adopted these humanitarian values. When you say humanitarian values, it's humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We respect all people, we serve all people, and we try not to get involved politically, basically, is the oath. The core humanitarian standards have been kind of bubbling. They're kind of coalescing now. Different groups started their own, and they've kind of merged into one in the last few years. And they've elaborated on these where now you have to pledge as a humanitarian that your response is appropriate and relevant. That means I am not giving feminine hygiene kits to males in an emergency. I'm trying to tailor to who's being received. The responses must be effective. You pledge to be effective. You pledge to do no harm. You try to include those that you're responding to in the decision-making process, so participation. You have some kind of a complaint mechanism that involved a whistleblower system. You promise to coordinate with the whole sector, not just go it alone. You promise to learn, and you promise to support your staff. And a lot of the larger NGOs are ascribing to these values. And then I told you in Istanbul in 2011, they voted the CSO effectiveness principles, which are their set of values that they value human rights and social justice, women's rights, democratic ownership and participation. They value the environment, transparency and accountability, partnership and solidarity, mutual learning, and sustainable change. All the beautiful things in the world, right? They're there. And from our friends who talk about, all value statements are the same, we would expect, pretty much this is a boilerplate value statement for any humanitarian organization. Let's just paste these words and be done, right? That's what we might expect. What I found is that the organizations are heavily influenced by those, but it's not a copy and paste job. There's some tailoring. And so inductively, I coded about, I think I'm somewhere around, right now, I've tried to stick as close to the wording as possible while understanding if the same words used with different meanings, I try to differentiate. I'm at somewhere close to like 80 codes. But I can lump them, I think, convincingly into 7 categories. I'm showing you 6. The 7th category I'm still fine-tuning. But it's also the least used category, so I don't feel like it's that big of a deal. So in some way or another, they talk about humanity. They respect it. They appreciate its dignity. They fight for justice, or they think that they deserve justice, or they don't discriminate. Somehow they're relating to the human. There's quite a few talk about solidarity, participation, empowerment, right? We would expect. Almost everybody wants to be trustworthy in some way, using the wonderful terms of accountability, transparency, integrity, honesty. These words that I'm showing you, these are the most used words in each of the categories, and then there's some following. People like to organizations like to collaborate. They talk about it in terms of partnership or collaboration, working together, collegiality, something to that nature. And then organizational values, they're independent, they strive for sustainability, they want to be innovative, they're experts, they're professional, they have courage, and usually that courage is related to being innovative. So they kind of circle back. And then we have this group called motivations, where they claim that, they want to let you know that they're doing this out of compassion, out of service, out of a love for God, they're committed to the poor, something to show their emotive side of themselves. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
So where do these clusters come from?
So I coded the value statements, and then I grouped them inductively. Yeah. Not that I was ignorant of these, so I tried to match them onto here, and when they didn't match perfectly, I had to think about how to rearrange and what was different. Is that okay?
So do all the organizations mention all this?
No, we'll get into that.
Have a number.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Right now, these are just the clusters, right? So let's try to relate governance and values. So here are those clusters that I told you. The approach one is the one that's a little more ambiguous, so don't read too much into it. It's things like we value a rights-based approach, or we value a humanitarian approach, or we value a gender-focused approach. It's approach-based, but all kinds of different approaches. So we have the motivations: solidarity, collaboration, organization, trustworthy, and human. Almost everyone, and these numbers here are in this governance type, the number of organizations that claim something related to that value, and here's the number in each cluster. The number in parentheses, which this isn't just missing data, it's important, but I'll tell you, this is the total number in the cluster. These are the number that had value statements that I could code, and I'll want to talk about that. So almost all of the organizations, care about humans. That's why they're in the humanitarian sector, right? They might care about humans in different ways. They don't want to discriminate at them versus they value their dignity. There might be some nuance in how that's termed, but something about the human. So they're in the sector. And given the prominence of accountability and transparency, everyone wants to be trustworthy pretty much, although it's a little less in this group here, in the support. Remember, this group is the group with the largest representation of organizations in the global south or in developing countries. Lots of them have espoused some form of organizational values, like they want to be effective or innovative or professional or expert, something like that. But then we start seeing a drop-off. Collaboration. The federations and hybrid federations talk about collaboration, but less so in the other forms. Solidarity, those in the support in the hybrid, again, they talk about solidarity. Remember, their boards are heavily filled with the world, not just donor countries. And then motivations, those two also talk a lot about their motivation for helping. And so do the ones with interlock boards, the more unified organizations. And then over here, confederations and interlocks tend to talk about their approach, highlight, we're unique because we do it this way, or this is our way of doing things, and they really highlight that in their value statements. So there's no statistics yet. So who knows if these variations are, significantly different. I haven't gotten that far yet. But you see a trend, and the trend has meaning involved, I think. Organizations that have motivation and solidarity, they have a global board. You're a member of the board not because you can contribute money, because there's an office there and there's people there. So you're part of us. So these are a lot of them are faith-based organizations, but everyone's included. The federations are the ones that, you're probably most familiar with, the Save the Children's, the plans, like that. They're as close to being unified as anything as you can be. The members are only if you contribute money, and generally if you contribute more money, you have more votes on the board. The Secretariat oversees all implementation, so all field offices then report to the Secretariat. So the funds come in, the Secretariat then takes it from there and is in charge. These hybrids, they've tried to include the Global South and everyone in decision making, but they also are trying to be centralized and organized. So they've been trying to kind of be in the middle, and you can see how they have their motivations and solidarity, but they also want to be highly organized. And this is our world visions. Things like our World Vision, ActionAid's in here now, AMREF, and SOS Children's Villages. I don't know if you know that one. Yeah. So they have representation. They have over 100 members each, except for AMREF. They all have some way of having influence on the board. But the Secretariat's still quite strong in saying how things are going. Confederations, these members are organized by their executive directors, not by their boards. So the EDs represent each other. They may have also a board level governance as well. The Secretariat doesn't do quite as much as far as implementation. The members do the implementation. And you notice they're held together not by their values like we like to think maybe, but by their approach. If we all follow the same approach and we have this same global brand, we'll all do our thing and we'll work together. Oxfam's in this group. ACF is in this group. They're coordinated, but they're not hierarchical. The interlocks are the ones where basically a central organization started other organizations, gave them their own boards. They publicized them in their annual reports as being independent, but the president's on all the boards. And so make sure that everything happens the way it's supposed to. So they look like they can be independent and everything, but are they? Samaritan's Purse is in this group. IRC is in this group. Heifer Project is in this group. And then we have coalitions. Now these tend to be younger organizations. Their secretariat may be one person that may be in its own office or maybe in the office of another one. They have a formal voting mechanism where the EDs get together and make decisions, and then maybe one or two people to share the newsletter or let people know that the different RFPs that are coming out or things like that represent them at the UN. They often have a Brussels connection or something, or a New York connection. But they're very loosely connected. And what in their value statements, if they have a value statement, because they're not so unified, they have the fewest amount of values that they talk about. And those values tend to be very pragmatic, like we value efficiency and effectiveness, and accountability. That's, they don't want to get into it too much. But they're also the least connected. Whereas in these highly centralized types, some are espousing 10, 15 values in their value statement. They can talk about everything because there's really only one boss, and so whatever that boss's values are, we can agree because we agree with the boss, right? So there's this variation. So, in sum, here's some of the observations that I've been making based on this, given that I observed this morning. There seems to be some relationship. I don't argue that, values determine structure, but there seems to be a relationship that there's between the values that we put in our value statement and the way we're organized. And there's maybe some logic to it. Centralized INGOs seem to express more values than decentralized ones. Maybe they have more unity. Organizations that emphasize motivational values, remember compassion and such, tend to have more developing country representation on their governance. It's an emotional thing. These also they also tend to highlight solidarity more than the others. Collaboration values, which, we all want to collaborate and we think that this collaboration, but often when they're talking about collaboration, they're talking about working together inside the Federation or inside the Confederation. They're not talking about collaborating. Occasionally they're talking, but usually they're not talking about collaborating with the larger world. We collaborate amongst ourselves. And these federations, confederations, what makes them interesting is federations, they use financial power to control. The more money you have, the more say. Confederations tend to say there's the approach. If we agree on the approach and you follow the approach, the way of doing things, you can have some autonomy. So you're as free as you want to be as long as you do exactly what I would do in your situation, type of a thing. Whereas the networks and the most loosely connected, they express the fewest common values, and they're the least centralized and least organized of them. They tend to come together for very functional purposes like sharing office space or writing a proposal together or something of that nature, rather than being kind of a unified entity. So that's what I've got, and thanks.